We can start, and we are happy to have Alon Rubinstein for our series on Price and Prejudice, and obviously the topic is going to be on discrimination, and we are all interested in hearing all the research insights that you will give us. Floor is yours.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much again for the invitation, and I really appreciate it. And I'm happy that we have a series on this subject. I found the research presented here and going forward that will be presented very interesting. So I'm happy, obviously, that this forum exists. In this paper that I'm going to present you, if I understand correctly, I'm going to do 25 minutes on it. It's going to be kind of a short version of a paper on price and prejudice, on customer taste-based discrimination competition. So if I had to kind of sum up, following Becker's seminal work, the common perception is that intensified competition in the product market is good in the sense that it will reduce taste-based labor market discrimination. I guess most of the empirics and theory has been focused on employer, in the sense that discriminatory, inefficient employers are competed away. And with regards to customers, there's not been as much research, but the idea is that discrimination could still persist in perfectly competitive equilibrium if the cost of segregation is high. So the overall effect when looking at evidence, if one does not disentangle between the two, is that more competition in the product market should reduce labor market discrimination. And the empirical evidence, I would say, is somewhat, what happened? Mixed. On the one hand, there's been some papers that found notable effect, while others found mild, even some effects that go in the other way around. And this kind of led to the idea here in this paper in trying to offer a different perspective on the impact of product market competition and labor market discrimination. And I'm going to show you theoretically and empirically that competition in the product market can intensify labor market discrimination when driven by prejudicial customers. And in terms of theory, I'm going to show you here a version of the Dixit-Stiglitz monopolistic competition model, while introducing a taste for discrimination similar to Spence's work on quantity and quality of product. And the idea here is now that the firms are going to compete on two margins, both on price and on prejudice. And in terms of the empirical setting, I will focus on the US banking deregulation that effectively ended local monopolies. Obviously, I'm not the first paper to look at this exogenous shock on labor market outcomes, but what I'm going to do in Advantage, which is not done before, is take into account the variation in occupational characteristics. The idea that some occupations interact with customers while others do not. Let me try to explain the theoretical idea in brief. And the idea is that the taste for discrimination vary with demand. And this will be the core importance here. The firms, monopolistic firms, will be able to tax customers with a markup on any attribute, right, if it is positively correlated with their demand for the actual product. So when thinking about it in terms of white and black customers, for instance, we would see monopolistic firms taxing customers for their taste for discrimination if in general they have a higher demand for the product or a higher income relative to black customers. And as you can guess, this tax, the idea of basically the monopolistic firm considering not the aggregate customer demand, but only the marginal revenue, will result from the firm to tax the customers and charge a higher price, and as a result, supply them less discrimination. All of this analysis is with regards to the product market. Now, what will that imply on the labor market? It will imply that when competition increases, the tax, the monopolistic competitive tax that the monopolistic firms will charge will be lower. And as a result, the labor demand, for instance, for white workers will increase. In equilibrium, we will get that the black-white wage and employment gaps will increase with competition and customers' taste for discrimination. So the idea here in brief will be kind of similar, I would say, although it's more complicated in a simplified way, similar to what we usually think of monopoly. A monopoly will overcharge the customers for their demand for the attribute, and as a result, they will pay more for discrimination, but will buy, quote unquote, less discrimination. The idea is that when discrimination, the demand for discrimination in the labor market drops, we will get that the wage gap as a result and employment gaps will not be as large. This is the entire idea here. And in terms of the empirical strategy, I'm going to use the US banking deregulation. As I said, this has been done before as kind of a competition shock in a monopolistic sector, which presumably exogenous to labor market conditions, been established by other research in this on discrimination or on gender gaps. What I'm going to take another advantage of using the banking deregulation is that when we're thinking about the banking sector, there is a lot of different occupations. There is the bank tellers or advertisers or financial bank managers that constantly interact with customers. And as a result, the customer's demand for discrimination might matter a lot. On the other hand, there's also a lot of occupations that have no interaction at all with customers, right? You should think about it, all the backend, the computer software developers, the accountants and bookkeepers. They do not interact with customers at all. And as a result, they will take advantage of a variation by customer contact. Another advantage of a variation in the US banking deregulation is that discriminatory tastes perhaps differ across different states. And one could see whether the effects are larger in states with higher taste for discrimination. So this is exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to quantify the deregulation's differential impact on the black-white wage and employment gaps by the required customers contact by occupation. I'll talk later on how I'm going to measure that. And then I'm going to assess whether this impact is especially large in states with high measures of discriminatory attitudes. I will obviously talk in detail on how I measure both. And in the findings, I'm going to show you that the white wage gap, decreases in occupation with low customer contact. This is kind of in spirit of a Beckerian argument on employer discrimination. Inefficient employers will be driven out of the market, and as a result, the wage gap will drop. On the other hand, the wage gap increases in occupation with high customer contact, showing you already here that in some sense, customer discrimination is more important than employer discrimination when considering occupations characterized with substantial customer contact, for instance, the service sector. And these effects are going to be very large, especially in markets which exhibit a more substantial competitive shock, and in states with high measure of discriminatory attitudes towards Black individuals. And I'm going to show you first time also similar patterns in employment gap as well. So I'm going to go talk very briefly about the model setting and the results, and then talk about the empirical setting and the analysis. So I should say in advance, I'm also developing showing the results also hold in models that are not monopolistic competitive one, but I'm going to use this variant for this presentation. And the idea here is that unlike the traditional Dixit-Stiglitz model, customers also place significance on the identity of a servicing employee. So they don't care only about the product, they also care about who services them. Okay, and they have demand for both margins. I'm also going to impose that there is kind of a two-sector economy. And the idea here is that employees in general don't have to work in the service sector. They can work in a different outside option, for instance, in manufacturing, which, for instance, will result in them not facing customers. So I'm not imposing that the employees per se have to face customer discrimination. They can work in a different market, and as a result, avoid such a discrimination. And to sum up, in this model, there's three agents. There's customers with willingness to pay both for the products and the employee's identity, firms that are interested, as we know, in maximizing profits, and the labor force, which is interested in maximizing their wage. So this is, I know, perhaps not the nicest thing to show, but Dixit-Stiglitz framework. Right, let me go quickly over all of the different notations. So we have N is the number of firms in the market, each producing their unique product. X is the units sold by firm I, of product I. Eta is the substitution between the different products in the market. I'm going to impose that they're a substitute, so it's between 0 and 1. And we have M will be the expenditure in kind of a different sector, not in the service sector, and I is the total income of this representative customer. And the idea here is, I'm going to introduce the idea that customers don't only care about quantity, but also about the share of A employees among firm. So here is two types of employees, A and B, and they have a demand for discrimination. They have a demand for type A employee. And in this setting, I'm going to impose kind of a traditional monopolistic competitive CS model or isoelastic utility. And you can see that there is two attributes here. The utility is a function, has kind of a common effect in red, which you see it's A of S, and it has an heterogeneous effect, which basically drive all of the results in this paper, will be the heterogeneity of the effect of discrimination on the customers. And let me talk about more that in detail just a bit. And the idea here is to look on the ratio of revenue between of a specific firm to the customer surplus. And what you can see from here is that there will be a distortion between the firm's objective in terms of maximizing their total revenue and the utility of the customers, and that would be sigma. So the way you need to think about it is sigma S is capturing the relative utility of a marginal customer relative to all the inframarginal customers, okay? This is the crucial idea here. It's exactly related to the Spence distortion in the sense that not all customers have the same demand for discrimination. Let me give you a few concrete examples to kind of illustrate it. So what you see here on the y-axis will be the log of price, and the x-axis will be the log of quantity. I'm here presenting it in terms of log, but that could be in general for price and quantities as well. And let's look at the dashed demand curve as kind of a benchmark and consider three different scenarios. In each one of them, the firm is now increasing the share of A employees. We can see the demand increases in all, but what is very important here is not the level, but the change in the slope. So for instance, if you look at sigma prime S equals 0, this is a case where there is no heterogeneous component. We will get that the effect of discrimination is a parallel level shift in the aggregate demand. And we will see in that case, one can think of the amount of quantity sold and discrimination as two separable decisions. However, it could be that we will be the case of the red demand curve. For instance, that discrimination will increase the aggregate demand, especially in high prices. For instance, if one would think that white customers are located mainly in the part of the aggregate demand which has a high demand for the product, we will expect that the shift and the change in the shape of the aggregate demand will be similar to the one in red. And on the contrary, if we would think it would be the blue, it would think that the effect of increasing discrimination will be mainly on customers with a low demand for the product. This will be the one in blue. I'm going to skip very fast on that. So firms have kind of a usual traditional CRS production function using labor. Nothing new here. And there's some fixed cost of interest. F units of production are forgo. Very standard Dixit-Stiglitz material. And in terms of labor supply, I'm going to assume here that firm need to decide between employment in two different sectors. The service sector, which is the one I described before with customer contact, and manufacturing. Now, why would customers want to, for instance, Black employees want to still serve in the service sector? Well, the idea here is that there is some heterogeneous component on their outside options. Some employees are very good, for instance, in manufacturing, or are very good, have a very high reservation wage, and as a result, they won't be very keen to work in the service sectors, while others perhaps don't have the same options, and as a result, they will be willing to face discrimination because the wage will be higher relative to their outside option. I'm going to impose here that the two groups are equally productive. So that means that if customers were not discriminatory, we should see no gaps in employment. The key here on heterogeneity, I should say, if you look at the equation below, on kappa equals 0, implies that there is some inelasticity in terms of the supply. If the aggregate supply was perfectly elastic, we will get effectively a model of segregation and no discrimination. There will be no differences in terms of wages, only in terms of employment. Okay, let me go quickly over the results. And what you can see very nicely in both graphs, you see on the y-axis, S, which is the share of A employees employed in the service sector, and G, which is the wage gap. And on the x-axis of the two graphs, you have 3 different measures of concentration. And the idea in all of them is that when you move to the right, the market is less competitive and more concentrated. On the left graph, it will be a social planner, which is interested in maximizing the customer's utility, then a monopolistic competitive setting, and lastly, a fully collusive monopoly, a cartel. While in the right graph, you see a case that entry costs increase. And what you can see very nicely from here is that if sigma does not vary, so if there's no heterogeneous component, we will get that the different market structures do not affect the discrimination at all. So less competition, more competition, wage gaps and employment gaps should say identical. On the other hand, we get that if we are in a position where sigma prime drops with S. Hello?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Massimo, you were saying something?
Yeah, no, I was coughing. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. So if we get, for instance, that the case in red in which the effect of discrimination would be to increase demand for customers with high demand for the product, which is the case in red, and make the aggregate demand steeper, we will get that less competition actually reduces discrimination, which is the case in red. And in green, we get exactly the opposite, right? That if, for instance, increasing the share of A employees results in a flatter aggregate demand curve, we'll get that less competition will increase discrimination. So, and the idea here again to why we have kind of a bit of intuition to the variation in the result is the idea is that the social planner is interested in maximizing the share of utility over the cost of production, while a monopolistically competitive firm doesn't care about the overall utility of all customers, but cares only about the marginal customer, because that's what affects revenue. The distortion would be exactly this sigma S, as you see in red. What about a fully collusive monopoly? That effect will be amplified as it takes into account the cost substitution patterns between the different products. Now, in terms of a bit of intuition, as I said, we could expect among the 3 scenarios that the effect will be of increasing discrimination will be similar to the one in red. What is the intuition for that? So in order kind of to set this ambiguity, I'm going to actually introduce a bit of the idea of Becker, how he thought about discrimination. And the idea is not necessarily of a numerical, I will say, minority, but the fact that the minority is an economic minority and not necessarily a numerical one. So for instance, if we had to arrange the customers in terms of the ones of type A and type B customers, we would expect that the type A customers will be with a higher demand for the product, correct? It's not that, and as a result, when the prices are higher, we see much more A customers than B customers, okay? This is the idea that in some sense, the group that is discriminatory, that has the taste for discrimination, has also a higher purchasing power. Okay, this is the crucial idea here. And to kind of in a simplistic way to illustrate what will happen, suppose I take kind of in a...
Sorry, Alon?
Yeah.
So could that be confused with pure economic interest, in the sense that if statistically we know that group A has a higher willingness to pay for my product than even as an employer, my preference to kind of cater the interest of group A could be driven by economic. So would not.
That's exactly the idea here, Massimo.
Okay.
That's exactly the idea here, that that putting aside discrimination, the type A customers have a higher demand for the product.
Okay.
And it is exactly that ordering that results in discrimination changing with market structure. One could show that if, for instance, type A and type B customers have the same willingness to pay for the product, right? Obviously, there's a distribution, but their distributions are identical. We will get that competition will not affect discrimination at all.
Okay.
It's all driven exactly by, as you said, that the type A customers, irregardless of discrimination, have a higher demand for the product, higher purchasing power.
Therefore, since the higher willingness to pay may come simply from income distribution, you are indirectly creating a conceptual link between income distribution across groups and discrimination.
Exactly, right? The reason that, I'll say differently, the reason that the demand for discrimination of type A customers matters is because they have a high demand for the product.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and just to illustrate kind of in a very simplific model, one could show if I take two distribution of willingness to pay of type A and type B customers, and I will impose that type A customers have a demand for discrimination. This is alpha S, and they have in general a higher demand for the product. We can show that on average increasing the share of A employees results in this reshape of aggregate demand that will affect mainly the top part of the aggregate demand distribution, consistent with the idea that more competition will reduce discrimination. Okay, now let me go quickly. What can we think about the idea when we have both customer and employer discrimination? Then it's unclear what would happen to the wage gap. And the idea is that there's two opposing forces. On the other hand, prejudiced, inefficient employer will be driven out of the market, which we would expect will lower discrimination. But on the other hand, the importance of customer discrimination is amplified. So one cannot compare between the two. But we can still say something about the relative wage gap with a market with more and less competition when considered two different occupations with no customer contact at all, and those with some customer contact. And the idea is that in occupations without any customer contact, we should see a substantial decline in the wage and employment gap as the market is more competitive. This is exactly the Beckerian argument, while in occupations that still have some customer contact, it could be that the wage and employment gap will not drop, but necessarily will not drop by as much. So when looking at the differential impact, we should see that the wage gap and employment gap are relatively higher in occupations with customer contact, following a competition shock. And this will be exactly the testable implications that we'll have here. Suppose I would have had some experiment in terms of looking at the wage of different employees, whether they're Black or not, whether they work in the service sector or not, and whether they work in a competitive setting or not. We should expect that the coefficient in red and the interaction between Black competition and the service sector will be negative, right? This is exactly the gap which competition and will amplify the prejudicial customers in the service sector. And this effect we should expect will be higher, especially when considering, I'll say, prejudicial states. PS, for instance, is a indicator of whether the customers have a high taste for discrimination or not. And this will lead to the empirical setting here. So I'm going to focus on the US banking deregulation. There's been a few different deregulations that occurred. The main one, which I'm going to present here, is the merger and acquisition branch deregulation. And as you can see, it occurred over different periods. And I'm going to take advantage of a fact of a different time at which it was established in each state. And I'm going to look at the census data from 1960 to 2010. And I'm going to focus mainly on male, US-born, Black, white, full-time, full-year, 25 to 54 employed individuals. But I'm also going to introduce a variable from the 1998 ONET data used in Deming's paper on social skill, which is called Deal with External Customers Importance. So let me already show you how it looks. What you see here is a distribution in the customer index Z-score within the banking sector. I'm only showing you the occupations with at least 1% employment in this sector. And what you can see that there is a lot of variation. So you see, for instance, on the left, computer software developers, computer equipment operators have a very negative and low Z-scores because in those occupations, there's not a lot of importance to customer contact. While on the other hand, you can see bank tellers, customer service representative, and managers and specialists in marketing, in advertising that have a lot of customer contact. The importance of customer contact in those occupations is high. And this is exactly what I'm going to look. I'm going to identify the importance of customer discrimination and how that interacts with competition by looking following the competition shock and the differential impact in the changes in wage and employment gaps across these occupations. There's a few different measures of discriminatory attitudes. I'm going to use 3 different ones in the paper. Here I'm showing you just one of them, which is based on the Giles and Gurian paper using the General Social Survey. And what you can see, the states in red are the ones with the 10 states with the highest demand for highest prejudicial tastes against Black individuals. The one in gray are, I'll say, the medium ones, and the blue are the ones with low taste for discrimination. And I'm going to look how the effect varies across states based on their prejudicial tastes. So let me go through quickly about the empirical analysis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a diff analysis, very similar to the Black and Strong one, which I guess the coefficient of interest will be, just as I explained before, on the interaction between whether you work in the banking sector, whether you work in that sector following the merger and acquisition, which increased competition, and whether you're a Black individual. And looking at this beta across different, and how it affects your relative wage across 3 different groups: occupations with high customer contact, medium customer contact, and low customer contact, divided based on those Z-scores. And let me show you now the effect. And I want you to focus on the top panel. what you see here is that the one in red shows you the relative black wage for high customer contact occupations following the competition shock. And what you can see is that actually the wage gap increased. The relative black wage dropped following the competition shock. And on the other hand, when you look at the one in blue, you can see that actually in occupations without customer contact, as we would expect, competition actually increased the relative black wages. Right? Really, you can see on the difference between red and blue, the differential impact of customer discrimination and how that changes with competition. In the bottom two panels, I divided it into unit and non-unit states. And the idea here, just to sum it up, in unit states, you need to think about it as states where the competition shock was stronger in that sense. And you can see kind of aligned with that, we can see that in some sense, the first stage is more important, the differences are more important, and especially in states where the competition shock was substantial.
So you are equating a competition shock is an act of the regulation here?
Correct. So I should have said the way it works in the banking sector is, and there's been numerous papers on that, thinking of this mergers and acquisition deregulation as causing more competition, in the sense that before we want to think of the states as one basically relied on a lot of local monopolies of one very large bank and a lot of small ones. And following deregulation, as I guess we see today, there's multiple big banks, but they relatively fiercely compete with each other.
Right, but in principle, in terms of the Herfindahl concentration index and so on, one could imagine that one deregulation would lead to a higher concentration of banking in a state.
That definitely could be the case. I totally agree with you on that, Massimo. I should say that this has not been a part of my project, but others examining this research have shown that following this deregulation, interest rates drops and profit margin drops, kind of aligned with the fact that there is less excess profits following the deregulation.
Okay.
But yeah, this is definitely what I expect here, kind of build on previous literature, that this shock serves as a competitive shock in the fact that there's more competition. Yep.
Basically, there is more price competition. I agree. Yes. Okay.
Exactly. I see I'm a bit running out of time, so let me jump to a few more equations. I'm going to jump a few results. Now, instead of just dividing it by 3 groups, I'm going to kind of introduce this C-score as an additional variable. And obviously, this equation is not the most nice one to see, but the idea is exactly the same analysis before, just interacted with a Z-score variable. And here you can see the results. And what you can see here in red is that following deregulation, the relative black wage in the banking sector was 11.1% lower in occupations with 1 standard deviation more customer contact. Right? This is exactly what you see here. In column 2, I divided it into states with and without the unit state indicator. And you can see, again, the results, not surprising, is you can see that the effect is insignificant, 9.7% in the non-unit states and a significant 16% within the unit states. Finally, I'm showing you the results when looking not only across all of the individuals in the economy, but only focusing on the banking sector. This kind of reassures you that the results that you're seeing here are not driven by something weird happening outside the banking sector, but also within the banking sector, we see the same patterns. Now, let me focus on this 11.1%, and let me show you the results when looking across the 3 different groups in terms of tasteful discrimination. So you can see on the top panel is the 11.1% we see across all states. but you see a lot of variation across the states. You see that especially the effect was large in the high prejudice state, that was a 24.7% difference, while in the medium and low prejudice states, the effect was marginal, and even in the low prejudice state, it kind of flips to the other side, correct? This is exactly what you get here. And to sum up the difference between high and low prejudice states, what you can see here in the column 1 is that following deregulation, the relative black wage in the banking sector, in occupations with one more standard deviation customer contact, was lower by 6.2%, but not significant. While looking at the total effect, this is the effect in the high prejudice state, the effect was 25.7%, really showing you that it is exactly those 10 states with high demand for discrimination, with high prejudicial tastes, that are driving the results. And in column B, 2 and 3, I'm showing you the results across different measures. So this was for the GSS, but also when using the Harvard implicit association test measure, or different measures of Google searches on derogatory words, you see the same patterns in the data. I see we're running a bit out of time, so I'll show you also the ones from employment, if one would ask later on. But just to conclude, I offer here a model that allows for heterogeneity in customers' discriminatory attitudes to study the effect of competition on labor market discrimination. I show that in contrast to common wisdom, the competition actually intensifies labor market discrimination in higher wage and employment gaps. And using the census and ACS data combined with data on banking deregulation and job requirement, I show that a black-white wage and employment gap increase in occupations with high intensity of customer contact, and especially in states with a high marginal taste for discrimination. And I should say that this paper, when thinking about re-examining the implications of competition and discrimination, is especially important due to the growing share of the service sector, especially for low-skilled individuals, kind of suggesting that we may, if we were in the case that the service sector is getting smaller and smaller over time, one could perhaps argue that this is customer discrimination. It's not very important, but we actually, for the last 4 decades, have seen a large growth in the service sector. Sorry for taking a few more minutes than I should. Thanks so much. I'd love to answer questions or comments that you all have.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting. Before asking if somebody else has a question, have you thought about considering the restaurant market, right? Where you could look also at the willingness to give tips, whether that changes. But of course, I don't know what would constitute a competition shock in that market.
Yeah, so one market I should say that I'm thinking about now and looking, which we have seen some competition shock, is actually the airways market in the US, which had for a few years a lot of different deregulations that results in changes in terms of a competitiveness across the market, and looking there on flight attendants. I just from a partial analysis, I do see that the results are aligned, but as you said, obviously restaurant markets will be very interesting one. But I think what is important is one has also obviously to think of a case where you have a presumably clean competitive shock on that will affect, that one could use to exogenously identify variation there, correct? But yeah, obviously, if anyone has additional ideas in different markets, I would love to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. Any question from the remaining audience?
Fabian has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very, very interesting talk. I have to mention that it was very nice talk. You could follow right through, and then everything was very, it seems very logical. So that was very, very great. One question from my side. So you've mentioned like competition on the market side, but competition on the demand for jobs. So basically, you're mentioning that one of your key assumptions is that you can shift between sides, right? From customer service to manufacturing. But in reality, this is more difficult. And then you've touched on this, I think, but could you expand a little bit more? What would happen if my demand for jobs would be more rigid than perfectly elastic?
So the idea here, just to explain, let me show you, go back to that figure. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, so what you see here is the service sector labor supply. Now, suppose the labor supply has no rigidity, right? So suppose you could hire any number of employees you want at the same wage. Then demand for discrimination will only result in the fact that you, for instance, will hire only white employees. Nothing will be reflected in wages, right? So you need some inelasticity that the effects of changes in the demand curve, in the labor demand curve, will also affect wages, right? So here I introduce the idea of thinking about an outside option, correct? So suppose there is a lot of individuals that could work in the service sector, but one of them, I guess, doesn't have a lot of opportunities. I guess his equivalent job is some manual labor, and the other one could work in Google as a computer software analysis, right? And the idea there will be that if a labor demand will increase in order to attract more and more, for instance, white customers, the labor market clearing condition will result in the wage of that group of a white employee in the service sector to increase. So you need some rigidity here, but I think what you were talking about, if I understood correctly, was moving from a perfectly competitive labor market, right? Kind of add some monopsony. So in that case, it is getting a bit more complicated, and exactly, I think, for the reasons that you would expect. On the one hand, the film takes into account that increasing the share of white employees, for instance, is higher, it costs more, correct? And as a result, will further reduce discrimination. On the other hand, it could be the case that those firms will really want to produce much and much less than before. And as a result, will kind of the identity of a customer will be one that is very discriminatory. It's always kind of a threshold on the changes between the two things. How much do I care about the customer's preferences? And what is the actual customer preference? So the idea here, as long as the firm is now not going to reduce by too much the quantities they will produce, even when you introduce monopsony, you will get the same results. I should say, though, that when considering monopolistic competitive setting, and for instance, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you had in mind, but suppose I impose that in all settings, we are not in a perfectly competitive labor market, but we are in a monopsony, and just increase and decrease the entry barrier. So examine what happens when we have more firms in the market or less. In that case, we will still get the same results. The only thing that could potentially change the result is whether a competitive shock in the product market will also result in a competitive shock in the labor market. When the two things occur, which I think this is what you had in mind, it's really indeed unclear which one is more important. Yeah. Thanks so much for that question.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Any other question? Very interesting. So okay, there is a question. Very good.
No, sorry, Massimo, I was saying there are no hands up. So I think
no hands up. Okay. So very good. So I think we can stop here. This was very helpful, and also the recording in case people will want to see it later. So it's definitely an important contribution also for the future life of the website and future research externalities that each talk can generate. So thanks for contributing this, and hopefully this will generate more and more research. And And in particular, I wonder whether you have thought also about how taste discrimination and statistical discrimination can be disentangled, when in this type of context where you have both kind of the economic interests that come from statistical discrimination on top of, cultural biases that vary across states on the customer side. But probably this is a subject for future research, I guess. So.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add that at one point on that. So the way you need to think about it is whether, in order to answer your result, is whether all customers have the same statistical discrimination. So for instance, do Black customers also discriminate against Black employees because they think they're less productive, or whether it is systematically different?
Yeah.
Correct? So if the effect is the same across the board, then all of the results that we see here is only driven by taste-based discrimination. On the other hand, it could be that if, for instance, white customers have a higher statistical discrimination against Black employees, then the results that you see here will actually be amplified. One should say, though, which is something I didn't examine here, it could be that if statistical discrimination is very important, then perhaps a firm has the ability somehow will think about a mechanism in which they could ensure that the employees are productive enough. For instance, a certificate or something like that when think about practitioners, for instance. But as long as that mechanism is not available, it will only amplify the result.
Right. No, but what I mean is that if there is customer discrimination that is mostly taste-based, the best response by employers could become to again select accordingly on race, let's say. Even though at the individual level, the employer is not taste-based discriminating, but it's the best response to that. And so if the best response to taste-based discrimination by customers in economic terms is to further discriminate, so maybe I'm not making myself clear, but then at the end of the day, if the total discrimination that you see is caused, as you say, mostly by taste-based discrimination, but is amplified by the, I think I'm saying the same thing that you're saying. So there is an amplification effect.
Exactly. And obviously this is why, especially in terms of the empirical analysis, where we want control, and basically the underlying assumption here is that across occupations, across state and time, there was not any variation in terms of the importance of statistical discrimination across this occupation. So this is something that definitely. I'm sorry.
No, I see your point.
Yeah.
Yes. Very good, very interesting. Let's stay in touch then, and hopefully many people will follow up. Thanks.
Appreciate. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Gemma.
Thanks to you too, Massimo.
Thanks. See you on the 16th.